Good evening once again, and good afternoon, and good morning for some of you. Welcome to this panel, international panel on truths and fictions in stories about the past. And I'm Tatiana Venediktova, chair of the Department of Discourse and Communication Studies in the Philological Faculty of Moscow University, and your host for this meeting. The topic, and I think most will agree, is quite hot globally. Plenty of questions. How do we tell stories about the past? As professional historians, as authors of historical fiction, or non-professionals, amateur, barefoot historians? How do we choose between modes, factual or not so factual or counterfactual? How do our stories circulate? What do they do? To what uses they are being put? What communal and communicational functions do they serve? To what extent is writing about the past an exercise in social responsibility and freedom? And to what extent an exercise of power and control? As George Orwell famously put it, who controls the past controls the future, who controls the present controls the past. Today we have the privilege to discuss such topics with brilliant scholars who have devoted their time and their intellectual energy to precisely these issues. Professor Kætrин Галлагер and Martin Jay, both distinguished emeriti at the University of California in Berkeley, in the respective departments of English and history. They have more publications and more teaching experience and more research accomplishments to their credit than can be given justice in this short introduction. So I would really like to thank Martin and Kætrин, if I may, for their willingness to share with us their insights and thoughts, and for being with us so generously, despite the early hour in California. I would also like to thank the Education and Cultural section of the U.S. Embassy in Moscow for facilitating the meeting of minds, shall we say. So we shall start with talks, one by Martin Jay on the necessity of rewriting history, another by Kætrин Галлагер, who will offer an introduction to the factual imagination. And then we'll hear a short response from a European Russianist, Professor RiccardoNicolozi, currently teaching in Munich. And his current research deals with counterfactual narratives produced here in post-Soviet Russia and earlier Soviet Union. So we'll discuss how historical storytelling ties up with values and with publics. We had some preliminary readings. These included Martin's recent paper on historical truth and truthfulness of historians, and Kætrin's most recent book, Telling It Like It Wasn't. Responses to these coming from scholars and from students of history, literature, and culture show that there are many more questions that we can really squeeze into a 2-hour slot or 2.5-hour slot. So a number of questions were submitted in advance, and they will come up later in the Q&A session. You're free, everybody's free, however, to ask new questions or share remarks in the chat. And my colleague and co-moderator, Anдрей Логутов, associate professor in our department, will help monitor this activity. The remarks can be put in English or in Russian. If in Russian, Andrei will do his best to render them into English for our guests at fitting moments or toward the end of the session. So this is it. And without further delay, may I turn the floor to you, Kætrин, Martin, Riccardo, in whatever order you prefer.
think I'm going to begin. First, let me express my great gratitude for Tatiana for this invitation. It's a pity we couldn't actually come to Moscow, but still this is the next best thing. And I'd also like to thank all of you for indulging us by doing this in English. And I know what a real achievement it is for the student tour. And I recall very much a conversation with our tour guide. And I asked him what his opinion of Leon Trotsky was and his role in the Russian Revolution. And the tour guide said, Leon Trotsky, I've never heard of him. He was simply not part of the historical memory, at least to the extent that this tour guide had an education in history. He had been written out of history in the Soviet Union in the 1960s. And when we hear about the rewriting of history, we often think of very pernicious revisionisms, perhaps the most obvious being Holocaust revisionism. And we think of the Orwellian turning of people into unpersons. And so there is a general sense that the rewriting of history is dangerous politically, dangerous culturally, something that should be avoided. I want to make an argument against that, an argument for the necessity of rewriting history. Now, this is a very contentious issue in the United States today, as I'm sure you know, with the toppling of statues, Confederate war heroes, the changing of names of racist heroes, and has become a major issue in what is called the memory of the past. But it also has played a great role in the actual, I would call it, professional historical accounts of the past, most notably concerning a New York Times initiative to focus on the year 1619 as the founding moment in America, which will be used perhaps in school curriculum. And I will come back to this near the end of my talk. The 1619 Project is an excellent example of the dangers or the potential in rewriting history. Now, the crucial issue, of course, is what we mean by history. And in English, and I gather also in Russian, the word covers both what actually happened, the Latin res geste or res geste, and the writing of what happened, the post facto narrativization of what happened. Historia rerum gestarum. And the problem, of course, is that when we say rewriting history, there is a tendency to slip from one to the other. What I'm going to argue today is that it's important to make a distinction between them and to add a third term in between them, in between what happened in the past and the writing of what happened in the past. And that third term is the evidentiary traces of what happened, very, very, let's say, select and imperfect and inadequate, nonetheless absolutely necessary historical record, which has to do with archival materials, has to do with material culture, has to do with witness testimony, all the sources, as we call them in English, of historical writing. I want to be absolutely clear that when I talk about the rewriting of history, I'm talking about the third of these. But the second and also the first part, as it were, the third. Now, just to make the point clear, history as what actually happened is an inaccessible object of inquiry. It's something that is both not present in front of us and is so capacious, so, in a sense, infinite, that it's an object that we can never accurately measure, the way we can measure perhaps a physical distance. It's something that will always be perpetually out of our grasp. So the question really is how we relate to it. Is there some sort of objective correlative? Is there a representational representation of it? Is there a way in which it somehow is still as a kind of almost Kantian thing in itself, inaccessible, and yet putting pressure on the way we recount the past? So that it's not as if it were utterly and completely absent, as if we were writing mere fictional accounts of an imaginary past. It's always there and yet always inaccessible. And so the crucial, we might say, link between the two types of history are the remnants of the past that we call sources. And here it seems to me we have to be especially vigilant. There have been many recent examples, and obviously examples in the past, of tampering with the record. And I think, for instance, of the 2014 discovery of the FSB's destruction of records for the Gulag Archipelago. I think of recent discussions of the ways in which when the British left their colonies, they burned documents deliberately to cover their atrocities. And I also think of the fear that exists in the United States today that Donald Trump, when he leaves office, will destroy records, will burn or at least erase the records of his own misdeeds. So the important, crucial, you might say, moral obligation of maintaining records, maintaining archives, maintaining all objects of the past that may have resonance in the future is an absolutely essential imperative. And to this extent, I am always in favor of maintaining even those statues or objects that a politically iconoclastic, destructive impulse would want to tear down, but putting them in a new context. And the great, I think, exemplary instance of this occurred when the Hungarians decided to put all of their statues from the Soviet period in a special space in Budapest. We visited Kathy and I some 20 or so years ago, in which they still are preserved, but they're now in a different context, juxtaposed with other statues available for future researchers. They haven't been destroyed in the kind of iconoclastic fury, but they no longer serve the function they once served. Now, it seems to me if we move from that level, the level of sources, the level of accounts, of narratives, of explanations, this is where the really interesting question occurs. We all know, of course, that historical accounts are in some ways imprecise, perspectival representations of the past. And I want to argue that they always contain, we might say, specific, let's call them deictic origins in a particular time and a particular place. Historians like to fashion themselves as omniscient narrators, like to identify with a fictional posterity, which is a future that somehow has the objective distance to get things right. But every historian is always located. Every historian is always situated. Every historian always has we might say, cargo of prejudices, which he or she brings with him or her. And it's necessary, and this is the point I've always wanted to make about the truthfulness of historians, it's necessary to be as frank, as candid, as reflective about these origins as possible. It's necessary absolutely to understand that no one is the final historian. No one will ever write the definitive account. And it seems to me there are at least 4 reasons why histories must be rewritten. The first is quite obvious. New sources emerge. Archives are opened. We discover new material artifacts. Or old sources are discredited. We discover their forgeries. We discover that they've been somehow philologically tainted. And we change the evidentiary base of our accounts. The second reason is that we recognize that, as I said a moment ago, we are always perspectively situated. That is to say, every history is written from a point of view. During the Historikerstreit, the historical debate, historians' debate in the 1980s in Germany, one of the most contentious books was a book by Andreas Hillgruber called Zweierlei Untergang, roughly translated as a kind of dual or second ruin. And the point that Andreas Hillgruber made was that it was crucial to write the history of the Second World War, not only from the point of view of the Allies and the point of view of the victims of Nazism, but also, at least on the Eastern Front, from the point of view of the Wehrmacht in the last years of the war. The point of view of the Wehrmacht protecting Germany against the Soviet army, protecting Germany against the Allied bombing raids, protecting Germany against the some 2 million rapes of German women that Soviet soldiers committed. And the point of view was crucial, not the point of view of the victims, but the point of view of the Wehrmacht protecting other victims. This is the ruin of innocent German lives on the part of the Allied destruction of Nazism. Now, Hillgruber and his side of the historians' debate lost. And most, I think, critics of their position, Jürgen Habermas among them, made the point that if we have to identify, if we have to accept a point of view, it is morally imperative for Germans, for all of us, to accept the point of view of the victims of Nazism, in particular the victims of the Holocaust, who would have been helped if the Russian invasion had been swifter, if the Wehrmacht had been weaker, if we had had a quicker end to the war. And so protecting East German lives, yes, from their point of view, crucial, but from the point of view of the Holocaust victims and other victims of Nazism, a very different account had to be made. But the point seems to be crucial, that it is a question of which point of view we accept. Sometimes we see histories written by the victors. We rediscover, know that in fact the victims should have their voices heard. Sometimes we write history as the history of great men, and we discover, no, the history of everyday life is included. So point of view is absolutely crucial. The next dimension of the rewriting that I think needs to be taken into account is something that Hayden White in particular has drawn our attention to. Hayden White, the philosopher of history, who has written in his meta-history and elsewhere about the importance of tropological narrative forms that we either consciously or unconsciously use when we implot the past, when we write narratives that create coherence out of the chaos of what is left to us by the historical record. And this involves, he claims, at least 4 or 5 different, what he says are perennial types. We can write history as if it were a comedy with a happy outcome. We can write it as if it were a tragedy. We can write it as if it were a satire. We can write it as if it were a romance, or perhaps we can write it ironically. Now, there is no objective correlative. In other words, we don't have an ability to say that it is essentially and inherently, as it once was, either a tragedy, comedy, or romance, or ironically understood, or satirically understood. There's no way in which we could make a decision, except perhaps on aesthetic grounds. And here, too, it's a point of view question. So from the point of view of the losers, history is tragic. From the point of view of winners, it can be given a comic, let's say, a happy ending. So to be truthful, we might say, historians have to take into account their own either conscious or unconscious narratological strategies, their own emplotment tropes that they may be using without fully understanding them, and recognize that someone else might employ a very different emplotment. The final reason why history is always, I think, in necessity of being rewritten has to do with the fact that history is never ended, even though the past seems to be absolutely past, because of the fact that history, as a narrative, has its endpoint in the future, which is still to come. So that we don't know the story until it is developed after the time that has occurred. And the example that I always like to give of this is a peasant running down the streets of a medieval town yelling, "The 100 Years' War has broken out, the 100 Years' War has broken out." Now, obviously, the peasant has no clue that the war will last for 100 years. We ended up calling it the 100 Years' War because we knew that it would last that long. So the historical meaning of that moment was not known to the persons experiencing it. So history is not entirely, at least, the recovery of the initial moment, the recovery of the experience of people living in it. It also includes inadvertent, unintentional consequences. It includes periodizations that an inhabitant of a particular moment cannot yet know. So once again, a medieval peasant does not know he or she is living in something called the Middle Ages. Periodization always involves a post facto categorization, which will be unknown to the figures involved. And modernity became post-modernity, and then suddenly we discovered post-modernity was not so post, and we're back to modernity. Many years ago, I did a piece for Irina Prokhorov's journal on New Literary Review. I can't give you the Russian version of that. New Literary Review on the year 1990 as a watershed year. And I argued in that piece, although from the point of view of the end of communism, the end of the Soviet Union, it was clearly a watershed. another narrative, the narrative having to do with the invasion of Afghanistan, the narrative that led in a way to 9/11, the American involvement in Afghanistan and the civilizational conflict between Islam and the West, it might have had a very different meaning. So 1990 may be in a different narrative, ultimately, the one that we're familiar with as the end of the Soviet Union, the end of communism. Only time will tell. So all of these create, we might say, an imperative to rewrite, to re-narrativize history. Now, the next question, obviously, and the most difficult one, and many of the questions that you put to my earlier piece speaks to this issue. How do we distinguish? How do we judge? How do we decide that these rewritings, these revisions of history, are not like the ones that involved the forgetting of Leon Trotsky's role in the Russian Revolution or the revisionist denial of the Holocaust? How do we distinguish them? And here I wish I could give you an absolutely watertight and perfectly clear standard by which to make that distinction. And I'm afraid I cannot. What I fell back on in that essay that I hope some of you have had a chance to read is the idea, first of all, that historians are compelled to justify their arguments. They have to justify their narratives by talking about the actual evidence in a truthful way. They have to justify their narratives by taking seriously alternative narratives. They have to justify their narratives by presenting their ideas and their explanations with a full accounting of the perspectives from which they're writing and the tropological decisions they made. They have to be, in other words, truthful not only about the past, but also, or their judgment about the past, but also truthful about where they are speaking from. What I've called before their deictic specificity, where and who they are, and the time they're writing. But historians are not omniscient, they're not posterity, they're writing at a particular moment, maybe with a particular bias, maybe with a national bias, and so forth. And they have to be as explicit about that as possible. The second dimension of this notion of institutional justificationism is the role of institutions. And many of you in the question and answer period were, I think, rightfully skeptical about a naive reliance on the integrity of institutions. One might say that there is a spectrum of institutional or professionalization that historians fall on. At one end, we have something like, say, the academies in 19th century European art. Academies which became basically gatekeepers. They had teaching roles, they had guardian roles when it came to galleries and museums. They decided who is an artist and who is not. And we know, of course, that when 19th century Impressionist and post-Impressionist art emerged, it was outside the academy. And ever since then, the academy has been understood as basically a stodgy, conservative, canon-preserving obstacle to artistic creation. So if the Academy of Historians plays that role, obviously it can't be a source of any sort of confidence in the integrity of historians. At the other end of the spectrum, there are professional organizations, for example, of doctors or of scientists who are credentialed, who are involved in peer reviews, who are involved in a kind of serious vetting of their arguments through experimentation and through practice. And in the United States today, we have a great debate, especially over the wearing the masks and vaccines, concerning those who believe in science and those who don't. And there is now a great deal of anxiety about non-scientific nonsense spewed by people who claim to be scientists and who are not. So faith in science is obviously not always perfectly placed. There are mistakes, scientists are human, it's revisable and so forth. But in comparison to pseudoscience, to false medicine, to the cranks who claim that they have solutions, we place, I think, a certain amount of warranted trust in science. Now, the Academy of Historians, the profession of historians, obviously is somewhere in between. And people have pointed out that there are obvious incommensurabilities, that historians don't always come to a consensus. There's no Habermasian ideal speech situation which produces an absolute consensus. Well, what I would argue is that the ongoing dialogue among historians, accounts, the ongoing attempt to persuade rather than coerce, is about as good as we can get in terms of avoiding an anything goes historical chaos, in which no account is judged better than another. I want to finish with one alternative, which seems to me a particularly frightening one. And that's the alternative of the state intervening in such a way that it decides which historical account is the correct one. And this, of course, occurs in cases when states decide there's some accounts which are basically out of court. The 1619 Project, to come back to that, tries to explain American history in terms of the first slaves who came to Jamestown in 1619, and sees American history as haunted by the racial question. And there's an Afro-pessimist position which is inherent in this, which says that the United States can never, in fact, because of its original sin of racism, never, in fact, avoid being somehow blighted by the ways in which slavery was the founding of the Republic. The official position is that, no, this is a mistake. 1620 is the one that really is a more crucial date, the date when the Pilgrims came. The date when American history is the date of religious liberty, the date in which American history unfolds from the Mayflower Compact and becomes a history of democracy. And this, in a way, is the official narrative. And Trump has argued that we now must teach patriotic history and avoid the 1619 version. Now, this is a battle that's still being fought, and there are critical left-wing opponents of 1619, Sean Wilentz, Gordon Wood, and others who pointed out problems in its account, in particular its attempt to understand the American Revolution as a revolt of slaveholders against the British who were going to free slaves. So there's a lot of debate about this. But what I want to argue is that any attempt by the state to legislate an official patriotic history is deeply, deeply problematic. And there's a book by a Russian historian, Nikolai Kopasov, I'm sure many of you know him, he was at Smolny in St. Petersburg, on attempts first to make Holocaust denial illegal, and then in places like Poland to sanction an official version of the past, which produces a kind of straitjacket historical justification. And I want to argue against that and fall back once again on the weak, but nonetheless still, I think, powerful idea of historians as a community of credentialed scholars, people who are trained, people who are able to argue in peer-reviewed journals. This does not mean, I want to also finish by saying, does not mean excluding the accounts of those of us who are not professional historians. The journalists, the 1619 Project was written by a journalist or journalists, or even the so-called barefoot historians who are amateurs who come up with alternative accounts. But it does mean at least having some, let's say, trust in credentialing, professionalization as a bit of a bulwark against the absolute chaos. What this leaves us with, however, is still pluralism, because the telos of historical accounts is not absolute consensus. It's not a single narrative that will be the definitive narrative. It's rather a conflict, an ongoing conflict of different interpretations, which have to, as it were, be, as I mentioned before, rewritten over time because of the various reasons that I suggested. Okay, I think my 20 minutes basically have gone by, and I'd be happy to entertain lots of questions afterwards, but maybe I should pass the baton now to Kathy, and she'll tell you a bit more about counterfactual history. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Marty. I think I might be commenting on some of what you just said as I go along here. But I do want to turn first to an introduction, making an introduction to the excerpts that you've already read from me. The book from which those excerpts are taken is basically a history of the mode of counterfactual history as it developed in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. That is, it's a history of counterfactual history. And the first thing I want to stress today is that counterfactual history has never been at odds with or even indifferent to either truth or facts. Indeed, historical counterfactuals, even the novelistic variety, tend to be far more dependent on established facts than are most forms of narrative, certainly including the realist novel. And to clarify why historical counterfactuals are unusually fact-dependent, I want to start by defining what I mean by that term, counterfactual history. I use it in a pretty strictly delimited way. A proper counterfactual discourse, to get into my book, must either implicitly or explicitly present us with a past tense hypothetical. That is a conditional conjecture of the if A, then B sort, which we pursue even though we know the if clause is contrary to fact. And I know that's a whole lot to take in all at once, but let me just give you an example. The sentence, if John F. Kennedy had not been assassinated in 1963 and had lived to be a two-term president, the conflict in Vietnam might not have escalated into an American war. So that sentence is a historical counterfactual hypothesis. The if clause is overtly contrary to the normally uncontroversial fact that Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. Nevertheless, the hypothesis ventures a probable consequence of the assassination's non-existence. So the hypothesis is not attempting to call the assassination into question, the fact of the assassination into question, or to imply even that we should look into it more deeply. It is simply asserting that but for the assassination, American history would likely have taken a very different path. And it ventures a surmise about what the difference would have entailed. The works in the category, therefore, are hinged on to the actual historical record, which the reader, assuming that this is a written counterfactual hypothesis, is assumed to recognize. Moreover, the hinge is usually located at a juncture that is widely acknowledged to have been both crucial and chancy. So you can see I'm piling up a lot of things that have to be the case about the facts that are countered by the counterfactual. That is, it has to be recognizable as a fact. It has to be widely agreed to as a fact. It has to be widely thought of as crucial in a historical chain of some kind, and it must be chancy. That is, it must be something that we can easily see might not, and in fact, easily might not have happened. So that readers or perceivers of this historical hypothesis are expected to know the relevant historical facts. And if you're reading one of these in a long form, you are usually reminded of them, of the actual, of the facts in our world in the course of the analysis, even as they are simultaneously, that is, the readers are simultaneously expected to recognize also the plausibility of the counterfacts. This is the form then requires that we keep two sets, if you like, of factual and quasi-factual information in our minds at once. What actually happened in our world and what we know to be the fictional imaginary facts of a narrative that we're reading. So to be interested in this JFK Vietnam counterfactual, for example, we must know JFK was assassinated in his first term, and we must also perceive that the murder was adventitious. That chancy counterfactual juncture in these works is called a nexus. It stresses that it is a particular point in time and space belonging to our reality that contained the potential of a different reality, which is now incommensurate with our own. It's the uncanny coexistence of competing historical possibilities at a single moment that seems to lift the nexus, that contingent moment in time and space out of normal temporality. The general counterfactual historical mode takes many forms, and yet they all feature these fact-based nexes. So that's the next thing I want to say about counterfactuals. Counterfactuals aren't really, say, a genre of literature or a genre of film. Counterfactuals are a mode that can be found across genres and across media, and that they are not just about things that didn't happen, but about things that might have happened in the place of other things that did happen. So once again, fact, counterfact. That's what makes them counterfactuals rather than ordinary fictions. There are basically three long-form categories into which the written forms of this mode fall. So I'm going to name them here and describe them very briefly. The ones we can group into a kind of heterogeneous category of analytical counterfactual histories, the kinds that historians use, and historians, especially of, say, military history, economic history, et cetera. These are often historical explorations of, again, chancy endeavors, military campaigns, economic crises, very close elections, revolutions, or assassinations. They use the conditional mode when describing unrealized potentials to remind us that we're only speculating about alternative possibilities. That is, they are not written in the normal past tense. They are written in that this might have happened. It might have been the case that JFK would have achieved some kind of negotiated peace in Vietnam, et cetera. They usually do not describe or narrate alternate realities extensively. That is, this is the analytical kind. Preferring to indicate them and concentrating instead on the aspects of the actual past that allowed for the likelihood of other possibilities. This kind of history engages in analysis rather than narrative, and it often entertains numerous mutually exclusive alternatives. Of course, it can sometimes be used in the sorts of revisionist histories Marty was just talking about. It often is used in revisionist histories, but it is not itself a mode of revisionism, and it doesn't often lead to revisionism. It is used most often in the military kinds of military histories I alluded to in the reading I sent on the non-existent Nazi invasion histories. So the analytical histories are only one type belonging in the counterfactual mode. A second type is what I call alternate histories, in which continuous sequences of departures from the historical record are described, resulting in a long counterfactual narrative, usually with correspondingly divergent fictional worlds. They still, though, these narratives must maintain the chanciness of the event they altered, making only the most plausible changes so that their world appears to be at the outset identical to our world in all other aspects. Moreover, in alternate history narratives, all the proper names usually refer to actual persons, nations, and other agents. The events are invented, but the characters are not invented. And it's usually in the character code that these alternate histories are chained through the character code, that these alternate histories are chained to the facts, that it's usually the facts about characters in our world that constrain the kind of thing that goes on in an alternate history. JFK, for example, if that's what we're thinking about, say the second term of John Fitzgerald Kennedy in the White House, we are constrained by what we know of Kennedy's way of being president. So that's one kind. So that's the alternate history kind. Then there's a third form, which I call the alternate history novel. And in that form, you have not only invented alternate historical trajectories and developing worlds, but also fictional characters. Combining with the various novelistic generic forms, these fictions allow for the illusion of a more complete alternative reality, presenting in detail the social, cultural, technological, psychological, and emotional totalities that would result from the imaginary alterations. That is, they do for history, for alternate history, let's say, what the historical novel does for regular history. That is a way of vivifying history, making it much more about daily life and private life. Obviously, it's this novelistic genre that departs furthest from historical fact. Very often, these kinds of alternate history novels are set further into the future, into a more completed alternative world than the alternate histories are. And yet they also remain tethered to the nexus event facts. Moreover, it's often this more recognizably fictional form that takes on the traditional function ascribed to art of telling us some more general truth about our world than bare facts can deliver. So I'm sure you've often heard it said that the novel gives us a truth about the world that history can't give us because it lets us re-inhabit the past. These are attempts to make us re-inhabit often a different present. And it's some truth about that the novel is trying to give us. And an example of that, would be Robert Harris's Fatherland, which is trying to give us a kind of sideways glance at our failure to recognize the effects of the Holocaust. So counterfactual historical works are fact-laden, I would say, instead of fact-free. Indeed, some have claimed that they overemphasize, and this is one of the complaints that historians often have about them, that they overemphasize the importance of discrete events and agents to the disadvantage of larger and more generalized historical processes. They take discrete facts and alter them as if that's really what history is made up of, a kind of pile of discrete facts. There are different kinds of dependence on fact developed over several centuries. And this is the third point I want to make in introducing this mode. The three kinds of the counterfactual mode, the analytical histories, the alternate histories, the alternate history novels, came into being in a chronological sequence and across a certain geographical range. The analytical type established itself first among historians of military history, mainly in France and Prussia during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. It's very much tied up with state formation, and it's very much tied up with the sciences of military activity that the state is pursuing. And those sciences are some of the earliest sciences to pick up on the probabilistic revolution in scientific thought and in mathematical thought. And counterfactual histories are deeply indebted to that. As we know them in the modern period, they wouldn't be possible unless there had been the probabilistic revolution in thought. The alternate histories later appeared in France. That's the long form narrative, later appeared in France, from which it spread to Great Britain and America by the end of the 19th century. So it appears in France as a formation that is basically responding to the changes in the French government and in the French attempt to regain and relive its imperial glory. Alternate history novels, then, the third form, featuring invented protagonists, were a 20th century innovation. They began appearing in both France and the US between the two world wars, but did not become an established subgenre of fiction until the post-war period, primarily in the US and Britain. And of course, as it grew up, that particular form was very much tied up with science fiction, especially time travel science fiction. But the spread of counterfactual, of historical counterfactuals then to all parts of the world in the late 20th century has really been remarkable. And of course, it spread too across all forms of popular history and popular culture, films most importantly. That raises another question though. Why have they become so interesting to us during the last, say, 50 years? First, I want to admit that I think they're interesting and have been interesting for thinkers for many centuries. That is, at least since the onset of modernity, because they are connected to a constellation of basic and perennial issues. The role of human agency and responsibility in history, for example, the possibilities of historical justice and repair, which I'll say more about, and the coherence of identity of individuals, nations, peoples through time. Because would I have been the same person if I had lived through different circumstances and I had had to make different choices, that kind of question. Indeed, even before counterfactualism was harnessed to military history, which happened in the late 18th and 19th centuries, the mode began in the context of theological and metaphysical debates during the 17th and 18th centuries, reconciling God's nature, God's omniscience, omnipotence, and omnibenevolence with human free will and the existence of evil entailed the question of whether or not human history might have been different. So of course, that's Leibniz is the philosopher at the origin of this. That question, could it have been different, remained open long after it was fashionable to think of history as God's providence. Historians and philosophers of history argued about determinism, have argued, still are arguing about determinism, causality, and contingency, all of which touch on the possibility of alternatives and their ontological status throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Moreover, in the last half of the 20th century, analytical philosophers borrowed from the old metaphysical debates by arguing that we need the concept of other possible historical worlds, that is Leibniz's invention, in order to explain how conjectural propositions about the past become meaningful at all in our minds, while others insisted that all causal statements necessarily make some kind of counterfactual claims, whether they recognize it or not. So philosophical interest in the nature and uses of counterfactual history, counterfactual historical thought experiments really shows no signs of abating. Other reasons they interest us are that counterfactuals tend to be used in contexts where historical understanding aspires to be consequential in the world. Instead of being satisfied with merely scholarly exercises, counterfactualists often want to apply historical knowledge to other purposes. So when Karl von Clausewitz, the Prussian military theorist, insisted that perfecting the art of warfare entails knowing not only what had occurred in previous wars, but also everything that could have occurred, he articulated the link between counterfactual speculation and the ability to gain knowledge from the past for the sake of future military planning. And that premise has carried over in the 20th century into other fields. So that today, just to name a few of them, counterfactual analyses tend to cluster in areas where historical data might inform current, say, policy debates. So You find them in economic history, in diplomatic history, in developmental studies, and in international studies. And of course, we frequently hear politicians drawing lessons from history that rely on counterfactual assumptions. If the free trade agreements had not been made, American workers' wages would have increased over the last 15 years, for example. If America had not invaded Iraq, the Middle East might still be relatively stable. If we all burned fewer fossil fuels, the sea levels would not be rising so fast. And indeed, as the distinction between natural history, that is planetary history, and human history breaks down further, counterfactual model making using massive amounts of data has become central to the drive to avoid environmental disaster. The debates that take place around such past counterfactuals should ideally encourage people not only to think about the causes of present conditions, as well as to recognize feasible alternatives in the present, and also think about consequences that might emerge in the future. In other words, counterfactual speculation is one way in which debates about history take on consequences, especially in democratic nations, but I think in all nations. In the late 20th century, of all the ways in which historical counterfactualism became consequential for us, perhaps the most important involved its affiliation with legal and political historical justice projects. The explicit use of past counterfactual hypotheses in the field of law began shortly after their appearances in military history in the mid-19th century, and they have become an indispensable tool of legal reasoning. It was in the 19th century that German jurists first explicitly recommended the use of past counterfactuals in discovering liability and guilt. For example, the driver is liable for the accident because the collision wouldn't have taken place if he hadn't been speeding, that kind of thinking. The legal and historical practices of counterfactualizing tended to develop along parallel paths for most of the 19th and 20th centuries. But since the end of World War II, they have frequently converged in criminal prosecutions for war crimes and crimes against humanity, as well as in historical restitution efforts and demands for reparations for collective wrongs. Even when not pursued through judicial processes, counterfactual legal historical reasoning has become a way of exploring the identities and responsibilities of political and genealogical communities emerging from imperialism, from tyrannous regimes, from civil wars, from calamitous change, from all kinds of deep subjugation. Through its uses in these various endeavors, the counterfactual mode has not only intertwined itself with our ideas of progress and justice, but also become an instrument through which we try to shape our future history. So that's one of the things that counterfactualism is most involved in. It's an attempt at a sort of historical activism, especially in the repair of history. So the ease with which historical justice movements have adopted historical counterfactualism underlies some other features of the mode that make it useful outside the discipline of history. From its earliest modern appearance, its overriding impulse has been to judge historical outcomes rather than simply, say, to know about them. Clausewitz explained that one counterfactualizes in order to judge the skill of combatants and thus place praise and blame. Going beyond the evaluation of individuals, counterfactualism encourages the judgment of anonymous and impersonal occurrences and movements, as if we could somehow weigh them against possible options on a scale that would reveal their greater or lesser effect on the common good of a community, a people, a cause, a nation, the environment, or humanity as a whole. Indeed, making such an evaluation is precisely what philosopher Gottfried Leibniz, who first suggested the use of counterfactual possible worlds, claimed God does. Leibniz argued that no historical occurrence should be regretted because God sees and judges all the simultaneous alternatives and chose the best among them. Throughout the 18th century, most historical counterfactuals were formulated either in support of this possible worlds theodicy, or as it was called, which always found actuality superior to any imaginable replacement, or in opposition to it, imagining examples of how history might have been improved. So it's not just diverging lines, it's often also evaluated lines of development, evaluated in terms of some superior, the greater good for the greatest number, as opposed to something that would have been less good for us all. So, the activity of judging, of course, is necessary to the activity of judging. It's necessary to have some kind of comparative option. But it's a truism that history studies unique and thus largely incomparable situations. That's a point that's often illustrated by contrasting the discipline of history to the laboratory sciences, where controlled and replicable experiments can be used to manipulate variables to determine what factors led to which outcomes. History, we're frequently reminded, must make do with thought experiments because it is, by its very nature, a record of unusual and unique occurrences, each not only situated in a singular, non-replicable spatio-temporal configuration, but also ipso facto, standing out from the ordinary, unrecorded progression of human affairs and the actions of unremarkable, or at least forgotten, people. Leibniz's followers explained that this is the reason we have trouble reconciling history, mainly an account of wars and disasters as they saw it, with the idea that God is taking providential care of mankind. Since we cannot share God's vision of other possible worlds, we have to imagine the worst alternatives, thereby demonstrating that it is reasonable to declare our own the best, even though our past may seem a chronicle of mere horrors. Conversely, when Clausewitz proposed counterfactual analysis for improving the military sciences, he often visualized alternatives superior to actuality. He attempted to demonstrate that even the best commanders leave opportunities unexploited. Although they were making very different kinds of judgments, they shared two assumptions: that history does not allow for exact comparisons between its always highly unusual events, episodes, and personnel. That's one thing. And that counterfactual speculation compensates for that deficiency. It creates imaginary comparisons. The uses to which the mode has been put are thus various. All of these different things come into the mix. But the motivation to make comparative judgment about history does seem to remain steady throughout. So I want to close this introduction with a glance at one further role counterfactualism plays. I think it helps satisfy our desire to quicken and vivify historical entities, to make them seem more multidimensional, suspenseful, and unsettled. And to explain how the mode performs this function, I need to name one of the most common and controversial practices. Counterfactualists tend to vary events while holding historical entities constant between our history and the alternate history. Thus, they generally assume that such entities, and these could include persons, governments, institutions, armies, political parties, nations, families, dynasties, empires, races, all of those things that make history, those things remain identical to those in our actual history, even though their destinies, the totality of what they think, do, and suffer, are changed. The assumption maintains that what philosophers sometimes called trans-world identity, although the framers of most counterfactual experiments can't be said to subscribe to any such elaborate theory, they merely follow a long-standing convention that takes the entities to be the usual constants of the thought experiments and the impinging events and circumstances, that is, their histories, to be the variables. The convention, we should note, allows for the subtraction. I just want to mention this because it's important, that the convention allows for the subtraction of historical persons and other individuals as the result of some altered event. I mean, really, the number of times Hitler has been deleted from the alternate world is really extraordinary. But even then, the subtracted entity is considered identical to the one in the actual history. And normally, again, in an alternate history, not true in an alternate history novel, but in an alternate history, fictional characters are not added to the personnel. The trans-world identity assumption applies only to the reference of the names of historical individuals or collectivities. So a fictional backward time traveler, for example, might prevent JFK's assassination or his birth, but he is still the JFK who, that JFK who has been lost or saved is still the one we know. That is the one that the writer is going to present us with is still the one who has to be drawn, who has to be portrayed according to the historical record. So the notion that the same person could have contradictory destinies has always seemed on reflection to be both necessary and problematic to counterfactual history. Considering JFK's possible second term, for example, we note that we must assume we are talking, as I said, about the same person who was murdered. Otherwise, the thought experiment would not be an experiment about our history, which is what it's supposed to be. But once the story is changed, how can we maintain that the person is the same? What do we mean when we say that our JFK might have had a second term if he had not been assassinated? That is there any meaning in that sentence? The question has bothered every counterfactualist, but the point I want to end with is that they nevertheless tend to put it aside and carry on with the narrative because our sense of what it means to be really an agent rather than just another unthinking cause, to be not something that's just an animated thing. Our sense of what it means to be really an agent is to possess possibilities. Counterfactual history, thus, seems to me to be a mode of revivification. It's a mode of bringing the past back to life in an attempt to prove that when it was present, it was like our present, replete with potential. So that's my introduction to the counterfactual mode. I hope it's been helpful. It certainly doesn't answer all of the extraordinarily wonderful questions that we were sent. And actually it was difficult to just sort of get through it without going off into my answers to some of those questions, but I hope we'll get to that in the question and answer. Thank you.
It was interesting to hear some of the questions answered even before they were asked. Thank you very much. And before we go on to questions, because there are questions, Riccardo, could you give us a short introduction into closer home into the alternative and counterfactual history practice?
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Thank you again for the invitation. My presentation will be a follow-up presentation to what Kэtrин Галлагер now said. This is in the related to counterfactual history, and it comes. This presentation comes from a current project I'm working on, in which I would like to write a cultural history of counterfactual narratives in the Soviet Union and post-Soviet Russia. So here I'm not asking the question of the epistemological value of counterfactual thinking, in history, political sciences, or in literature, but I'm asking the question under which conditions counterfactual thinking is possible or not possible, right? And which kind of cultural functions counterfactual thinking in historical sciences and in literature has, especially related to the memory of a given culture. So this is the setting. And related to the Russian culture history of the 20th and 21st century, my hypothesis is that the attitude to counterfactuality has been rather ambivalent, oscillating between fascination and rejection, necessity and impossibility, and freedom of imagination and what I call a ban on thinking, which is the translation of the German term Denkverbot. So the impossibility of thinking about events in a counterfactual way. To give you an example, in today Russia, it's really difficult to think counterfactually about the Great Patriotic War, right? About the Second World War. It's just hard to ask the question. If you ask the questions, then the outcome of the thought experiment will be a confirmation of the facts. This cannot be too much imagination about this question. The first point I would like to make is about the terminology. In English, we speak about alternate or alternative history and of counterfactual mode, as Kэtrин said. And in Russian, I think there is just one term. It is alternativная история, so alternative history. And as far as I know, alternativная история could be everything. Could be a speculation, any kind of speculation on the course of history that differ from historical facts. So alternativная история, alternate history in Russian can be a conspiracy theory, which is, of course, is not counterfactual history. Because for counterfactual history, as Kэtrин has shown very convincingly, you need this point of bifurcation in the history, in facts. So you need a starting point out of which one or more new historical sequences develop. Alternative conspiracy theory represented in Russia, for example, you might know this theory of the new chronology by Fomenko, it's not counterfactual history in this narrow sense. It doesn't have a point of departure, doesn't have a bifurcation. So I treat counterfactual history in the sense of Käthrin Галлагер, so as in the narrow sense of this word. So we need this point of bifurcation from facts. And in this sense, is counterfactual history a very conservative way of thinking history, because it needs facts, established facts. And these facts are usually events. Crucial events in history are the role of the personality in history, just to quote Plekhanov, the very famous text by Plekhanov, which, by the way, does in his treatise about the role of personality in history, lots of counterfactual thought experiments, which, of course, confirm the nomothetic idea of history, of his vision of historical materialism. Of course, the outcome is always the same. Now, this is about this terminology. So I would see a counterfactual history as a specific variety of alternative history. Now, the second point is that in my project, I look at historical sciences and literature not as two different discourses, but two discourses that produces the counterfactual mode. And counterfactual narratives, so long narratives based on counterfactual thought experiments. So I think that I don't see the two modes, of course, identical. There are many differences between fiction and thought experiments, counterfactual thought experiment in history. But even if we take into account all differences, then I think this is still not possible, but actually necessary to conduct a joint exploration of historical and fictional counterfactuals if we want and this is what I want to do, to analyze the cultural historical dimension of counterfactual thinking. On the starting point of my approach, which is a follow-up approach to what Kэtrин Gallagher did in her book, is acknowledging that counterfactual models are to a significant degree determined by historical cultural factors and dependent on their context. This is obvious, but this fact has been ignored, especially in the analytical mode of counterfactual thinking in analytical philosophy. If you may think of David Lewis's book, Counterfactual, which is seminal in this context. Historical cultural contexts of counterfactuality are not seen in this book. They don't play any role. Which kind of cultural function can have counterfactual thinking in literature and in historical sciences? In general, I think exercises in counterfactual thinking in historical sciences and fiction appear to be an expression and engine of certain perception of history in a given cultural context, as well as of changes in these perceptions. Exploring potentialities that remained unrealized in the past serves not only as a tool of working through historical events to understand these events better, rather counterfactual historical models are also a way to reflect on cultural mechanisms that cause them, right? On the mechanisms that cause counterfactuality. And here we must bear in mind two factors. First is the dynamics of cultural memory. And secondly, the epistemic precondition of historical scholarship. Briefly to the 2 points. To the first point, I think that counterfactual imagination articulates a certain form of cultural memory, that it constructs and empowers, since collective memory retains in some form not only what happened, but also what could have happened. So what could have happened is part of a cultural memory at the same level, if not more, than what happened. On this basis, it can be claimed that counterfactual models shape not only future past, that is, past potentialities that were never realized, but counterfactual models shape also the present insofar as they tell a story of how the past is treated in the present. And I think the example by Kэtrин Gallagher on the Nazi Britain is exactly about this. Counterfactuals in history and literature construct, transport, and modify images preserved in memory and collective imagination of history. And my point is that the function of such exercise in counterfactual thinking is ambivalent. They can challenge established patterns of historical interpretation, but they can also confirm these patterns. They can destabilize official perceptions of history, but they can also affirm such perceptions and thus make them more stable. And this stabilizing function of counterfactuality can be observed, for example, in deterministic interpretations of history, such as the Soviet version of historical materialism. Just to give you another example, in the very famous Kratki Kurs, the short course of history from the 30s, the Stalin's version of history, you can find them many exercises, many thought experiments, counterfactual thought experiments that of course confirm the course of history and not destabilize them. The second point is for me also important, very short. I think that counterfactual scenarios in historiography and literature can be an articulation not only of specific cultural memory, but also of their own epistemic premises, because they often reflect and problematize the historiosophic precondition of their own origin. So in doing so, they explore, among other issues, the relationship between determinism and contingency, hagiographic and nomothetic perspectives, myth and factuality in and of history. So my point is, even if even a novel in the genre of science fiction or time travel has elements of reflections about the epistemic premises that allowed the author to think counterfactually about the past. Thank you. This would be my contribution.
Thank you, Riccardo, and thank you again, Catherine and Martin. Shall we make a very short 5 minutes break before we go on with questions? Would you like to make a break? Okay, so it's just 5 minutes before. Let's go on with the Q&A session, okay? I've been trying hard this morning to look through the questions that were sent in, and I was tentatively, because we can't possibly cover all, put them into 3 heaps or 3 lines or 3 rounds of discussion, probably. It's very obvious that a point of common interest and questioning is what Martin, in Martin's phrase, institutional justificationism. That is the way a community of scholars, and us here, we're all scholars of history, more or less, even if not historians. Well, it could be history of literature, history of culture. So all of us are looking for this new identity. And there were plenty of questions about communication within the profession and this search for self-definition. And I would ask Anna Егорова and Andrei Oleynikov and Olga Pánova and possibly Diana Nemec-Ignashev to come up with the questions here. Then the second line dealt with what came up with what Riccardo brought up. That is the way historical narrative is always intertwined with cultural practices, memorial practices or educational practices, aesthetic, other. And here we had questions from Irina Morozova and her students, and Darья Hlevnюk, and probably somebody else. And yet, the third heap or line was about what came up so beautifully towards the end of Catherine's discussion, Catherine's talk. And it was all about the unique potential counterfactual writing might have. Its structure, its the opportunities, the possibilities of making meaning that it possesses. And here we have questions from Alexandra Tanchilevich, Anna Shvets, Artem Zubov, and Oksana Gavrishina. So there's plenty to ask and discuss. And if anybody has more questions, and I'm sure people do, please use the chat or, show a hand somehow. But try to keep to these 3 routes or 3 lines. Okay. Thank you very much. So, Anna, are you with us? Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for giving me the floor. Tatiana, thank you very much for organization. Martin and Catherine, thank you for wonderful talks. They were very inspiring. And I think Tatiana should have already sent you my question, so I'll try to be very brief. So my question would be to Martin, and you've already admitted that the perfect public sphere, as it was described by Habermas, doesn't seem to function in, especially nowadays, technological and social networking space. So my question would be whether it is possible that your approach of commitment to truthfulness and institutional justificationism could be somehow applied in the sphere of non-professional historians, since professional historians appear, at least more or less, to be already complying with certain norms and standards, whereas in the sphere of non-professional historians and in the place where we can find all sort of different narratives created by people outside the community, we discover that it is precisely there that support for alternative facts or counterfactualism is seen. So would it somehow be able to use this approach or communicate with it to the people who stay somehow outside? Because I think there is the big problem of this separation or this division line. And if it's not addressed, then I am very much afraid that post-truth is going to stay with us.
Well, I would certainly agree that this is a real, clear and present danger, and that the internet and the democratization of access to information and to the expression of views, which can very quickly go viral and which are very difficult to refute, creates a real emergency when it comes to the competition of narratives. In the United States now, we are in fact in the middle of an extraordinarily dramatic example of precisely this kind of issue, with the current president of the country denying the history of an election that occurred a month ago, claiming that the election was rigged without any evidence, without any facts. And apparently a sizable proportion of at least the population that supported him in the election believes his counter-history, which is a history based on myth and wish fulfillment and outright lying rather than any evidence. Luckily, and of course one can't be too, let's say, Pollyannish about this, but luckily the institutions that depend on evidence, the institutions that say, well, you can claim this was the real history of the election, that it was a fraud, that it was based on all types of manipulation, you can claim that, but there is no evidence to show it. And so far, that position is winning. The position, we might say, of professionals who say, look, either in a court of law or in the court of public opinion, or certainly in the ultimate historical account of what really happened in the 2020 election, your fantasized alternate history will be seen as, in a way, illegitimate. But the fact that this is enunciated not by a fringe, not by people who are, completely amateurish outsiders, but by the actual president of the country, is extraordinarily alarming. So I have no, formula which will allow us to escape this, except for the vigilance on the part of people who are part of what we might call the evidence-based and logical and self-critical part of the population, which includes people who are the experts, but also includes people who are part of a larger, let's say, lay audience of people who are interested in the protocols of making statements in public that have some evidentiary and logical basis. But you're absolutely right to be concerned, because we have a breakdown of the normal, or at least traditional vetting, gatekeeping mechanisms, which have prevented nonsense from becoming mainstream, more or less prevented it. And now with the democratization of the media, the conspiracy theory possibilities have increased, and the gullibility of the population, alas, has been shown to be far greater than we assumed. So I have no answer to this. I wish I did, but I do think that we have to have continuing vigilance and keep the professional accounts, still in the forefront, and take them seriously rather than dismiss them as simply yet another voice in a cacophony of competing and totally, in a way, indiscernible voices that can't be seen one better than the other. But that's a kind of weak answer, but the question is really one that troubles me, and I think all of us today. And as the Trump denial of the past shows, it's not an academic question. It's a very, I think, vital political question as well.
Thank you.
Andrei? Yes, Andrei Oleynikov.
Yes, thank you. Do you hear me? Thank you, Martin, for your very informative and thought-provoking talk. I think it doesn't make sense to voice the question which you received from Tatiana, as I hope. Maybe it will be better if I just clarify as briefly as possible the idea, my question. My question has to do with sorry for interrupting. Something wrong happened with the connection. Yes.
No, we hear you fine.
But yes, I'm going on. I'd like to say that I don't dare to pretend that I understood well enough what institutional justification really is. But I got an impression that among so-called three plausible alternatives that you formulate when you write in your text that you don't want to choose between two untenable extremes of radical positivism and radical constructivism. Your sympathy definitely belongs to the last alternative, which you marked as an institutional justificationism. And I think that this option has a pronounced ethical focus. And my question is exactly about this. I really like the ethical content or ethical dimension of your concept of truthfulness, but it's a bit strange to me that you portray truthfulness as an exclusive virtue of the professional community of historians. It seems to me that today we are experiencing a situation where it's increasingly difficult for professional historians to maintain the ideal of historical knowledge that developed during the scientific revolution about which you are writing. In addition, we see that new strong players have appeared in the public sphere who are interested in promoting their vision of history and their images of the past. These players include government institutions and influential producers of mass media. Therefore, it seems to me that today there is a dividing line. It seems to be that it doesn't make sense to make a divided line between the supporters of historical truthfulness and the various protagonists of post-truth, but between different concepts of practical usefulness that history brings. It seems to me that today we are witnessing a situation when history is returning to its practical meaning formulated by Cicero as Magistra Vitae, and I will be grateful to you if you find my intuition anyhow truthful. That was my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was somewhat difficult actually to get the sound on that, so I'm not sure I've gotten it all. I mean, I obviously agree that there's an ethical imperative and that history is a worthwhile endeavor in any culture trying to make sense of where it has come from, where it might be going, what it values, how to live, how to avoid doing certain things, how to live with other people, how to somehow make sense of a world, which is still, in many respects, extremely opaque. That we try to make sense of our lives and where we are going as a society. And one way we do that is by understanding where we have come from and the types of lessons that we learn from that. Now, it's quite clear that the idea of history as a kind of teacher of life depends on the notion of learning from the past. And we've discovered what I would call both good and bad lessons from the past. But it's quite possible that we misinterpret the past in such a way that it gives us a false understanding of where we should go. For example, in the interwar period in Britain, the apostles of appeasement were so appalled by the horrors of the First World War that they decided basically to avoid war at any cost in such a way that allowed Hitler to gain a kind of advantage because of the desire for peace on the part of the appeasers. So sometimes there are the wrong lessons. In the United States, we learned the lessons of Vietnam, which meant that somehow we had to either enter a war to win it or not enter a war at all. There were lots of disputes about how to get beyond the lessons of the past. So I think it's always a question of who is doing the drawing of the lessons, what kind of ethical imperatives would come out of the past, and how we understand the options that we have in the future. So I'm not a believer in the simplistic notion of history repeating itself, and we have to avoid simply doing what happened in the past. But there are lessons, nonetheless, which can be learned. And I think when Kathy and other people talk about counterfactuals, it's partly in the hope that thinking about the past in terms not merely of what happened, but what could have happened, gives us a greater sense of what those lessons might be, and gives us a greater sense of the ethical imperatives, or at least possibilities or choices that we might make in the future to avoid bad outcomes, or perhaps to encourage good outcomes, or to reverse the bad outcomes of the past. So all of these, I'm not sure if I truly have addressed the question, but all of these are ways in which history does have practical impact. And a society that forgets its past, that has no memory of its past, either publicly or professionally, is a society in trouble. Whether or not it's done this through negligence or through a deliberate attempt to forget, this is a society that will not really have the advantage of knowing its own cultural DNA, we might say, but also understanding the other cultures that existed and which have different experiences which might inform the future actions of our culture as well as others. So I hope that comes close to answer.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Olga, Panova?
Yes, good morning and good evening. And thanks so much for this really fascinating talk, because counterfactual history is always a fascinating subject that we never can get tired to discuss it. And my question was probably for Kэtrин Галлагер, because in the article that we were reading for this talk, Swastikas in the Strand, actually you start with keeping apart the study of the past by professional historians on the one hand, and counterfactual history with its hypothetical thought experiments on the other. And the problem is actually that the line between the two, that is between scholarly research and all types of counterfactual mental operations, is increasingly blurred in the postmodern world. And scholarly research may become practically indistinguishable from art or play, the spheres where people are employing the fictive to construct imaginary worlds, or from propaganda, using fictions in an interested and biased way. There are both opportunities and risks in the merge of disciplined empirical study and unbridled creativity or political activism. And so do you think the hypothetic fusion holds promise, or should we rather resist it? And if we should resist it, what can we do and in what way? Thank you. Your mic. Sorry, Catherine.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think that that it's always been the case that there's been a mix of creative fiction and history going on in everybody's history project. In fact, that is that they're never cleanly separated. Just to go back to the article for a second, the thing that struck me as interesting there is that the military historians are so certain that there was never any possibility of any kind of invasion by the Nazis of Britain in the summer of 1940. There's just simply wasn't on. And that's actually something that the Navy kept telling the populace at the time. Nevertheless, most Britons still think to this day, that is, this is just a matter of getting the history that the historians have in their own community, as Marty would say, in the community of historians, they've come to a consensus about the possibility. They say there was never any possibility. Nevertheless, in the collective imagination, it was something that was just about to happen and was only, avoided by basically their own activities by the RAF, et cetera, et cetera. So an enormous myth system built up around the 1940 idea. And I think in some ways, both of those we'd have to categorize as history. And it goes back again to the same question that Marty was answering just a minute ago. That is, what is the difference between a collective memory of things and the more, from our point of view, trustworthy, based on the archives and based on actual probabilities sense of what really would have happened had they invaded. So these were both counterfactual understandings, let's say, of what might have happened. Nevertheless, they are miles apart in terms of what they understand the potential to be. And is this a threat, or is it, an opportunity that these kinds of splits exist? Actually, I mean, I guess that's the question. Really, it's a question, first of all, of whether or not history and fiction merge here, and also a question of whether or not historians can control history, whether or not the people don't make their own understanding of history based on, and this is what Riccardo was talking about, based on the fact that the collective imagination is part of what happens. So the fact that the people felt threatened during the summer of 1940 cannot be overcome by the historians telling them they were not threatened. They're going to believe in that threat no matter what, because in fact, the threat is a part of the historical reality. We also can't deny that, if you see what I mean. So as it goes on through history and gets picked up more and more in overtly fictional forms, like alternate history novels, it's expressing more the experience of having felt threatened than it is anything about the actual threat. And so, can we say whether or not this is a risky fact about history, that it can't be controlled by historians, or can we say instead that it presents all kinds of opportunities because people will get their own will pass down their own historical experiences through family lore and all kinds of popular culture regardless of what historians say. And I don't think we can make a determination there. I mean, I don't think that we can decide, I don't think we can decide between, we can recognize the risks of that, I think. And at the same time, we can recognize the opportunities, because I think a lot of the opportunities have actually been quite creative as they worked out. Does that answer the question at all? I mean, I don't think, I think it's undecidable whether or not we are, whether or not we would like to suppress this, or whether or not we would like to produce more of it so that there are simply more representations of what might have been to choose from.
Thank you. And I think there was Diane's question along the same line, more or less. Diane?
Yeah, Diane is.
Yeah,
Diane, yeah, I'm here. I don't want to take time from my colleagues in Russia. I just wanted to thank you for fascinating, just absolutely fascinating presentations. And it's interesting, you answered my question really about history and how far away we're going to have to be from this election to ever consider, first of all, communities of competence who are going to evaluate it, and how far we're going to have to be away from it before we can come up with counterfactual. We already have so many counterfactual histories. Will there ever be a principal one? I did have a question to Professor Galлагer, and that was, I wanted to know if you included, and I missed the beginning of your presentation, if you would include as genres of counterfactual history, time travel back into that period.
There's the counterfactual history novel really begins with time travel novels. It's one of the most popular forms, and and because it begins with time travel, it has at its inception a certain kind of skepticism about the possibility of changing the past. The writers of time travel fiction very quickly discovered that they were involved usually in writing ironic, paradoxical accounts of changing the past, mainly because a time traveler would go back into time to make a change in the world, and would so disrupt the past that they got rid of the conditions under which they had done the time travel in the first place. So the experiment would fail over and over and over again. And there are lots and lots of very popular novels about this. It actually began with some absurdist French writers in the 1920s just playing around with narrative time. But that formal innovation has actually been very important. And one novel, it seems to me, that uses that beautifully is Octavia Butler's Kindred, if you've ever read it. A very important book to me, because what it tries to do is to take seriously the idea that African Americans are partly a wronged race because their women were so often raped, and therefore they genealogically carry, as it were, this kind of this problem of themselves being the products of a crime. So what Octavia Butler does is to put this woman in the situation where she is actually present at a moment when she could prevent the rape of her own great-great-grandmother as a slave by her slave master. And then she has to realize that if she does that, then she won't exist. If it's true, if this is a way of looking at African-American history and identity in general, then what can be done about that? That there's some way in which it becomes completely there's no righting of the wrong if you are yourself the wrong, in other words. So she finally decides not to prevent that rape on the grounds that it would wipe out the genealogy that resulted in her. But that over and over, it's called the grandfather paradox. And so that particular kind of issue, to what extent are we complicit in all of the conditions that produced us? And when we undertake projects of repair of the past, metaphorically going back in and trying to change those conditions in some way, to what extent are we not necessarily acting against ourselves, but to what extent are we simply trying to push off our complicity and to pretend that we are not actually the products of the same conditions that we're trying to change? So it's that kind of thing that time travel involved in counterfactual historical thought leads us to. And I think it goes along also with what Riccardo was talking about as the meta aspect of counterfactualism. It's the way in which it's always problematizing its own epistemic premises, which is one of the reasons why these sorts of things are very much part of the avant-garde, the 20th century, mid-20th century avant-garde, Borges, these other writers.
Thank you.
Thank you. This certainly brings us into the problem of the cultural context. And there were a number of questions dealing with pedagogy, or how we teach history, factual or counterfactual, and about memory. So it's Irina Morozova and Irina Bryanцева possibly, and also, of course, Darья Хлевнюк, somewhere here.
Irina Bryanцева and Georgi Martirosyan. What will be the first one? Tatiana,
Whoever.
would you like to start with whom? Okay.
Any of the Indians. Either of them.
Then I will start. First of all, thank you so much, Tatiana, and many thanks to our speakers. The subject itself is fascinating, and thank you for sharing your ideas with us today. I have questions, and I suppose that you got all my questions, so I will be very short. And
Here, choose but one, okay? Just one.
I would like to ask Kэtrин about the genre of testimony. Shall we take its documentary nature for granted, or rather explore its counterfactual potential as the work of imagination? Because, you mentioned in your speech about testimony, and so, Kэtrин.
Thanks very much for that question. I mean, I think that the genre of testimony, especially as it figures into processes, especially to juridical processes that have to do with repairing the past, or at least changing the current conditions that some past wrong led to. That seems to me to be a very important issue. It seems to me that testimony is all because it's testimony. It's always asking to not to be taken for granted as true. There's an odd way in which, as soon as you say this, you must. I am a witness to this. You must take what I have to say as the truth. That immediately that kind of there's an immediate resistance to taking it in that way. What that normally gets presented as, though, is the question of subjectivity. And I like the fact that what you've done is slightly different from that. What you've done is to talk about it in terms of the imagination, which is a different way of thinking about it. That is the extent to which it's not so much the reliability of the person who is testifying to something he or she saw, but the necessary input of that person's imagination that we should take into account. Now, whether or not that has counterfactual potential isn't exactly clear to me. That it has perhaps instead that kind of potential for revealing what the collective memory something is, the extent to which not just the accounts that one's heard, but also the very activity of testifying to shape a collective memory, how that creates differences, perhaps, from whatever else it's supposed to be up against. That is some, quote, objective, some point of view from nowhere, some God's eye view of what the historical looks like. I don't know if that's an answer to the question, but
yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thought-provoking.
Yes, Irina?
Yes.
Your question, please.
Thanks. My question is for Professor Jay and maybe Professor Галлагер add something. What do you think about using alternative history novels in school history lessons? Will this contribute to the development of children's analytical abilities, or will it only confuse them? Thanks.
We can't hear you.
I wonder if that could be repeated because I didn't quite catch. So,
yes. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Louder. Irina, louder, please.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
What do you think about using alternative history novels in school history lessons? Will this contribute to the development of children's analytical abilities, or will it only confuse them?
Well, it depends, of course, on which novels. I mean, when I taught European intellectual history in the 19th century, I always used Flaubert's Sentimental Education, which is a novel basically about 1848 and about a variety of responses to the events of mid-19th century French history. And Flaubert was a realist novelist who tried in complicated ways to make sense of his own period. I mean, it was written in 1869, but it looked back 20 or so years. And the students, I think, were much enlightened by the way in which it brought to light both the events of 1848 and the period around then, around 1848, but also the techniques of writing realistic fiction in the 1860s. In other words, it was, we might say, a stereoscopic experience, one that was both documentary about the period which was the subject of the novel, but also, in a way, an illumination of the formalist premises upon which the novel was written and in which realism as a form, an aesthetic form, was developed a few years later. And so if you use novels in that way, not as transparent, in a way, transparent mechanisms to look at the past as it really was, but rather as both attempts to allow aspects of the past to shine through, but also as ways to aesthetically shape the past and make students understand that a novel is not an historical account, then I think it is extraordinarily helpful. So I would say, yes, if you want to understand, I don't know what, say Napoleon, War and Peace is a very, very helpful tool to use, but with an acknowledgement, of course, that Tolstoy is understanding Napoleon from his own perspective. And you could think of many other examples of that. So I think we're lucky to have aesthetic mediations of the past, you might say. And novels are not the only versions of that. to give us some access, but we also must have the stereoscopic understanding that they are also aesthetic, we might say, evidence of how formal, tropologically inflected ways of understanding the past were themselves part of what we're trying to understand. So it's a dual answer in a way. Yes, it's helpful as a mirror or as a window, but also as itself an artifact we understood historically.
Thank you. And Dar'ya, I think it ties up with your question on memory.
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me and for letting me participate in this event. I am a memory studies scholar, and this topic has been touched upon quite a lot today, and I'm very grateful for that. I would like to maybe rephrase the questions that were already touched upon, collective memory. I feel they were mostly about the fear of culture and collective memory, sort of attacking history or being this untrustworthy alternative to history, which is a bit different on how memory studies scholars look at it. So I wanted to rephrase this line of question into a bit of a different line. When we study memory work, and especially memory actors, we do encounter a lot of counterfactual histories there. I myself study the collective memory of Stalinism in Russia, and of course there's a lot of discussing of what would have happened if Stalin didn't do that or didn't do that, and we would lose in the war, and so on and so forth. I'd like to think about that as the narrative produced by memory actors that are themselves more of political actors rather than historians, because these counterfactual narratives are produced with very specific ideas in mind, with very specific agendas. So I'm wondering, given that memory actors are these sort of hybrid actors, more of political and social actors, less of historians, can we still use the instruments and the tools that Kэtrин especially works on in her book, dealing with mostly historians, to study or maybe even to work in memory fields? Or do you think that these limitations of collective memory actors and this very particular political stance they have limits it and prohibits us from transposing these ideas and tools into the collective memory field?
I do think that there's always going to be a split between the historians' uses of counterfactuals and what you call the memory actors' use of counterfactuals. There just simply is. There's going to be, what fascinates me is the way in which every time somebody comes up with a kind of exculpatory account of, say, forced labor during the Second World War, somebody else, it is in response to something. It is in response to someone condemning that practice. A good example in the American context is that every year, it seems, on the anniversary of the dropping of the first atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the same debate comes up about, why did we do it? Should we not have done it? What would have happened if we hadn't done it? Over and over again. And it goes on, again, interestingly, completely without regarding the work that, say, military historians have done on the alternatives. So the Japanese and military historians got together in the 1970s and played out a long war game to figure out just exactly how many civilians would have died if there had been an invasion rather than the dropping of the atomic bombs. And they basically came to the conclusion that the same number of Japanese would have died in an invasion that died in the dropping of the bombs. This is never referred to in the debates that happen in the press, in which, as you say, are carried on really by these memory activists, who are simply asking, how are we to regard this? You know, what are the actual questions of it? So it's, I just think there's a tremendous distinction between the attempts on the part of the military historians to sort of do the hard work of all the statistics and all the probability theories and making all of those models, doing all of that work and getting that into people's consciousness. And even if they did, it would not settle the problem. And it shouldn't settle the problem, because, you know, to do it in purely quantitative terms, which is the kind of thing that a military historian can do, is not going to really answer the bigger question about nuclear weapons and the potential for, you know, for the destruction of the planet. So, I mean, so there are many bigger issues involved here. I'm not sure that answers the question for you, but in general, I would say that even when counterfactuals are used in that kind of defensive way, it seems to me that they're still doing the job of making people think about what the alternatives might have been.
If I may add just 2 words on this point, I think it could be useful to use those categories of communicative memory and cultural memory, right? The difference between communicative memory and cultural memory. Both are part of the collective memory. In communicative memory, you of course have a lot of counterfactual thought experiments based on the person, on the events. Just to make an example, the blockade of Leningrad, right? In the communicative memory about the blockade, there's always been the idea what would have happened if we would have given up Leningrad, right? The Red Army wouldn't defend Leningrad. In the cultural memory, till now, you cannot ask this question, right? This is taboo. And this is, and to the cultural memory belongs not only historians, but politicians and so on. So maybe the difference is between communicative memory, which is more informal, and the cultural memory to which belongs not only monuments and celebrations, but also this kind of exercises in counterfactual history, which are possible or sometimes not possible.
Thank you. We have less and less time, but we have still a few questions dealing with the form and function of counterfactual history writing, very specific. Alexander Tantilevich, you have a question on eventfulness?
Yes, thank you very much. My question is for Professor Галлагер, and it is about eventfulness. You say, in telling it like it wasn't, that a state is sort of personified, like a character, because, for example, it can die, just like a person. Also, while in real history we know the outcome, in counterfactual history, we pretend not to. So suspense is created, which sort of also adds to the personification of a state, because a state can sort of behave like a protagonist for whose life where the reader is worried. Hence the question, functioning as a regular character, may a state develop a consciousness, like a capacity to anticipate, evaluate, make sense of, and react to events, and as a result, maybe even to become a focalizer, so that the reader is urged to evaluate whatever the state sees from the state's point of view. And as a result, whereas normally in fiction, an event is something that is perceived as such, either by a reader or by a character. The question is, does personification of a state in counterfactual fiction influence eventfulness? Thank you.
There we go. That's a fascinating question to me because it really goes to the heart of what a collective character might be. And I think that one of the things we often don't talk about in writing history is just that most of the agents are collective agents. That in world history, especially, the actors, after all, are states. We know that there are people the personnel of those states that are making the decisions, but we can't take it all the way back simply to the individual actors. There is that thing called the state, which is the maker of history. And one of the interesting things about alternate histories often is that they do personify the state. They personify the state by threatening the state with death. That is the main way in which they do it. So it's a vivification through sort of torture, the threat of ultimate harm, the disappearance of the thing called the state. And my argument is that that's why that it's really a way of getting us to love the state, which is a thing that we don't normally feel very much love for. But that's the personification we're talking about. Now, even at its most vivified, however, the state is going to be a very weak protagonist for almost any kind of narrative. And so that's one of the odd things about these counterfactual novels is that the way they try to get around that is often by choosing protagonists who represent different aspects of the state. So we're not really seeing, as to your question of, how far can we go with this personification issue? One of the first things that tends to happen is that you get the policeman standing in for the state, for example. The policeman being the aspect of the state that the citizenry comes into contact with. But then the policeman almost always generates another side of the state, which is the secret side of the state. And so the spy then also comes in as a different kind of sort of stand-in figure in order to personify the state. But the odd thing, and the reason so many of these novels are ironic, the odd thing about that is that the spy, as a figure for the state that we don't see, the secret workings of the state, very often can't even be seen by the state itself. That's the figure the state has actually, the people in charge tend to have no control over. Those are the people who are constantly sort of spinning off. And their strong, what we might call protagonicity, their strong agency in the stories gets split off from the state. So one of the things that interests me about these novels is the fact that they really need to personify the state. And one of the ways in which we can see the limits of our, let's put this exactly, the limits of our ability to imagine what a collective character might be is by watching the ways in which they flail around with these different protagonists who are supposed to be the embodiment of the state. So I don't think it's never actually successful. And as I said, the problem is that collective characters in general are going to have these qualities of what we might call weak protagonicity.
Thank you. I hope there are two short questions, except every short question tends to be an enormous one. Артем, yours, please.
Yes, thank you. So my question is for Catherine Галлагер. And I just want to say that I was fascinated by your presentation, specifically because you talked from the perspective of fictionality, and as I understood, a little bit from the perspective of text world theory. So my question is to you as a historian, and specifically as a historian of fictionality. So how do you think, would it be fruitful to think and write about fictionality in a mode of alternative or counterfactual history? Would it help us better understand how people of the past perceive different modes of fictionality or distinguished fictional and non-fictional discourses, and therefore better understand how we people of the 21st century deal with these differences? And then the question specifically to you again about your analytical method. Do you ever use those modes of thinking and writing explicitly or implicitly? Thank you.
Explicitly, no. Actually, not at all. I don't actually have any talent as either a counterfactualist or a fictionalist. I'm just not good at it, which is one of the reasons I'm so fascinated by it. I'm the person who has to sort of explain how it works, whereas other people pick it up intuitively. So I must say, I think I'm the other kind of critic, not the kind of critic who can see, that's how they're doing it, but the kind who's always scratching her head and wondering, now, how do they do that? So I'm not tempted to write, say, a counterfactual history of counterfactualism. I do often sometimes ask my students, which so in the teaching it gets in, ask my students to think about how we assemble, say, canons or book lists when we're teaching, and what kind of a picture we would have if we took this author out and put another one in. And certainly we've done that a lot with canon formation and canon revision. So we've thought about it in that way. How does it look? It looks very, the tradition of the novel looks very different when we think about it from the French point of view instead of from the English point of view, for example. So that's just a kind of comparative thing. Or what would have happened? Suppose we took out the three main 18th century male novelists and just substituted other people who were not as interested in fictional personae. How might the novel have gone? But to tell you the truth, my sense is that literary history is already a little too invested in the individual author, so that it might be a better idea not to encourage that by doing that kind of substitution. I think we all do a kind of counterfactualizing when we read novels, nevertheless. That is, we read novels in order to get a different view. We read historical novels, we read novels from different periods, precisely in order to get a different view from what we can get in the history books. So in that way, we're doing what Marty calls revisionist history whenever we're reading a novel. And as he said, as he gave an example of the way he uses novels in order to do that. I think that's a very important thing to remember, that is one of our normal literary practices.
Thank you so much for this definition. And not to exhaust you further, one last question from Oksana Gavrishina, if she's here with us. Oksana?
Thank you very much. I'll actually post my question to everybody to see her. Is it visible? Thank you very, very much. What I would like to ask, and listening again today, how we speak about history, we often still tend to speak about history in terms of events, what happened, what could have happened, while I would really like to think about how differently we can describe to ourselves and to our students and to much broader public what is history. And that's exactly what we are discussing today. So we are not only saying that history is what happened in the past, but we're saying history is what happened in the past and how institutions work around it. And then we teach sort of, what I'm trying to say is that we include in the definition of history all this various workings of narrative, of institution, what Kætrин was speaking about, this entities. It's not only about events, but it's about so many things. And then we are saying we practice history. We practice it in different contexts. And we are not trying to say that this is a good practice and this is a bad practice as such, but we're trying exactly to describe them as fully as we can as various practices involving various actors having different consequences. And we make exactly that the point of discussion, not just what happened, what could have happened, and I say this happened, and another person is saying this happened. So what I'm trying to say is that we really might want to broaden the definition of history when we speak about it. Thank you.
I would absolutely agree that reflexivity and self-consciousness about what constitutes both the object of inquiry, that is, say, history as the res gestae, this notion of what occurred, what happened, what was experienced, what actors did, who made what. That on the one hand, and history as the writing or representation or narrativization or reconstruction of what happened. And we have to keep both of these balls in the air. And just to look at the first one for a second, we have to also ask the difficult question, what is the difference between merely events that occurred that are not part of history and those that become historical? The idea that something becomes historically meaningful, becomes historically memorable, becomes historically effective, rather than something that simply is a repetitive and meaningless and ultimately forgettable aspect of human existence. And what we've learned, of course, is that those definitions, that the distinctions between the two, this is a very fluid and in some ways still open-ended distinction. So as I mentioned earlier, we used to think that history was the deeds of great men, the deeds of kings and popes and great writers, and that everybody else was forgotten. And then we discovered that, well, not only men, but women made history. And then we discovered that not only great men and women, but also ordinary women made history, ordinary men made history, forgotten history. So that the definition of what was historical in the past became itself a source of reflexivity. And we tried to discover what we could with the sources that we had of a past that had been forgotten, neglected, marginalized, and seen as not yet historical. Now, from the point of view of how we then record the history and how we make sense of it, well, I would have to repeat my whole talk to come back to that. But I think also the sense of history as a recreation of possibility, what sometimes called side shadowing, in which you get a sense of contingency, is absolutely crucial, rather than get a sense of the absolute determination. And yet at the same time, we have to also be aware of probability, of likelihood, of the ways in which certain outcomes were not destined, but probably going to happen. And so this is a way, when we teach it, to give students a sense of the excitement, the adventure, we might say, of trying to make sense of a target, an object, a subject matter, which is not fixed, which is not dead, which is still in some ways to be enlivened, to be reanimated, to become part of who we are through our, in a sense, collective representation, whether it's a memory or in the esoteric texts of historians, but somehow something which is a dialogue between present and past, which then affects, and this is the crucial thing, the future. I mean, that's the exciting thing about history, is that it's not dead. It's also, in some sense, something that projects into the future in ways that mean we are connected with those who came before us, but also with those who will come after us. And history is part of that larger cultural flow, dialogue, drama, we might say.
Thank you. It's a fascinating exchange, and I'm sure we could go on and exhaust you enormously. But before we part, may I ask Yuri Rogulev, who's probably the person who knows most about American history in Moscow University, since he was sitting quietly there. Could you share with us what you heard while you were sitting?
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, I was sitting, I had been fascinated by, as everybody else, by both lectures. I have read with great interest to both pieces which we have been sent. And the topic, of course, is endless for discussion. Everybody talk about history. Everybody like to talk about history and historians. And historians are often criticized. Why does it happen? Why does it attract so much attention? But a lot of this had been said already. What I might add to our discussion. First of all, I must add to the Martin J presentation that history is changing over the time as a profession. Constantly changing. History is changing under the influence of other branches of sciences like sociology, political science, economic history, even psychology. Contemporary requirements for historical knowledge and research are not the same as they were in 19th century. That is why, Martin, it is not enough today just to write about history of events, to write about what happened. This is not enough anymore. There are new requirements. And in certain way, these new requirements for historical knowledge contradicts to the purpose of truthfulness. Why do they contradict? This is a basic contradiction of historical approach, because historians are required not just to write about the events of the past, but to raise and answer questions, to give some explanations, yes, to give some analysis, right? And ironically, all these are not correlate very much with the commitment for truthfulness, because that makes historical research much more personal, much more subjective. If you try to evaluate, if you try to raise questions and answer them. But this makes historical works much more fruitful at the same time. So these basic contradictions, which required from the contemporary historians to give explanation, certainly creates a lot of discussions we already heard today, and which are endless anyway. The second addition the second factor I would add is that historians, and which shows the difficulty of the profession of a historian, that historians do deal not just with the facts, they deal with people and what people did in the past. And this is much more complicated thing if you try to explain what certain people, groups of people, or certain leaders did in the past, and how you can evaluate what they did. Since people are the human beings are irrational, irrational in their acts, in many of their things they did in the history, it creates a lot of you never know what this or that person thought in reality. What did he had in his mind or her mind doing some things, right? That's why that makes it much more difficult. yes, history is developing as a profession, but it makes it more difficult and more contradictory, I would say. The second is the counterfactual model, or counterfactual approach. I agree with Kэtrин that professional historians do not trust this, do not accept this. I do have some of my colleagues here. Maria Sirotinska is here. She probably remembers and would confirm my words that sometime about 20, 30 years ago, all the historians had been fascinated by the book published by two American historians, Fogel and Ingerman. They were economic historians. And what they actually did, and we had a lot of discussions of this book, it was a counterfactual model approach to history. What they did, they took an economic data and made a projection about slavery as a means of production. And their conclusion was, if you project this data into the future in the 19th century, you would see that the slavery as a means of production will die by itself, making the Civil War useless, irrelevant. You know, Civil War was one of the most bloodiest war in the history of the United States. But and we had a lot of discussion about this book and about this approach, and certainly Civil War was a much more complicated issue, much more complicated problem. But I agree that the counterfactual approach may provoke such, discussion about the character of such an event as the Civil War. In this context, it was useful. I mean, such an approach was useful. At least we had a lot of discussions. So I think that, yes, we have so many opportunities. We have so many facts which are brought to us. We have much more new evidence, and that is why history is constantly rewritten. And I agree completely with Martin. I would add only to this problem of rewriting history, a generational approach as well. So when the new generation comes, usually it begins to write their own history, their own understanding of the past. So I can go on and go on and go on, but I would stop here. And I thank you. I thank Tatiana Venediktova for inviting me, and I'm very impressed by the discussion we had. My old brains this time of the day are not very good, as well as my English after a long day and several classes already, but nevertheless, you excuse me for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I think it seems to be that Kэtrин had something to offer in answer.
No, that's yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, unless somebody has some urgent idea or something, I'm sure not at this time, because we are out of time. And may I use this moment just to thank Martin, Jay, and Kэtrин Галлагер, and RiccardoNicolozi, and all of you who attended this discussion and participated in this discussion for your generosity, your thoughts, your, to quote Kэtrин, dual answers, because there are always dual answers to any serious questions. And I hope we'll have more of this. And I hope to see you, Martin, and you, Kэtrин, in Moscow, not in some foreseeable time, hopefully.
Great pleasure.
Yes. So thank you all very much. It was a pleasure and very, very useful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.